Today, we become legends.
Alright, today I'm going to be bringing you something that a lot of people have requested for a long time, actually. It's going to be the power curve tier list. I think this has probably been done before. It's not a terribly original idea, but I thought I'd give my take on it because I've had a lot of people request it in the past. So essentially, I'm sure any of you that play Smite know that some gods are late game, some gods are early game, some gods are in between, some gods are all-rounders. So yeah, these are the tiers basically. We have the early game gods, the early mid-game gods, sort of an in-between. We have the mid-game, mid-late game, sort of in between mid and late. The fully late game gods, and then a category for all-rounders, because when I was thinking about making this tier list, I was like, there's going to be some gods that are really kind of all-rounders, that are strong at all stages of the game, but not like super good at any of them. So we have that tier for that. Sorry about the camera quality, by the way. I'm at home. I don't have my lighting set up. My room isn't the best for this kind of stuff because I'm at home. I'm not at my place, but hopefully the camera quality is okay for now. It should be back to normal within a few weeks or so. But I like to do face cam on these tier list type of videos. It just adds a little bit of extra spice. You know who's talking to you, and it's not just like a static screen for most of it. You can see me talking about the gods and stuff like that. So I decided to go for a face cam on this one. But yeah, let's basically just get started. So Achilles is a weird one. I feel like Achilles could be an all-rounder. I think that's probably the best place to put him. He does tend to lean more early game, but Achilles can definitely do work late game as well. He has an execute. If you build him full damage, you can play like an assassin and just dive the backline late game. He's not amazing late is the only reason I was considering not putting him here, but I think Achilles really is kind of an all-rounder type god. He's like a little weaker early and a little weaker late. He's like pretty strong throughout the early, mid, and mid-late game. I think if the god fits in sort of 3 or 4 of these categories out of 5, they're probably an all-rounder. Moving into Agni, who, to me, honestly feels like an all-rounder as well. Maybe the all-rounder category is going to get a little bit bloated here. I'll try to not place like too many gods in here, because I feel like a lot of gods you could just slam into the all-rounder category, and I don't really want to do that. But I think Agni really does fit that bill pretty well. Pretty strong early game. He has the dash for like early wave clear and stuff, gets to mid very fast, but like late game he can bomb over walls and do a crap ton of damage to people as well. AMC, so he's a hunter. Hunters tend to look more towards the late game in general. He's slightly better of an early game than a lot of the other hunters have, but I still think AMC is sort of more of like maybe a mid-late game god. He's not super late game like you would think of maybe like an Artemis or a Kali or something, but I think he's definitely mid-late. Apuash. I'm starting to realize this is a very difficult list to make because I want to put half of these gods just straight into the all-rounder category, because in general, gods aren't designed to be like super weak at one stage of the game and super strong at another stage. They tend to be sort of strong at a lot of stages of the game or all-rounders. I do kind of want to put Apuash in all-rounder, but once again, I don't want to just fill this category up with like too many characters. I think for now I'll put him in all-rounder. I'm going to see with this though. If this category starts getting bloated, I might try and move people out of it. Anher, probably mid-game, I would say. Obviously, he's a very early game driven hunter, but just by virtue of him being a hunter, similar to how I said with Numbers and Cab, he tends to skew more late game. I'd say Anher is a slightly more early game pick than AMC. Anher does look for that sort of like early game ability burst damage quite a lot. Amaterasu, probably mid-late. She does pretty well in the laning phases actually, and she's probably close to being an all-rounder with the bust that she got. I think you could definitely argue for Amaterasu being an all-rounder pick. But in general, especially in the past, Amaterasu typically has aimed for that late game where she can get like big value from her ultimate and her auras and objective play and stuff like that, so I think mid-late is pretty fine for her. Anubis, probably an all-rounder. He does suffer a little late game because of his lack of mobility and anti-heal coming online, which is why I want to maybe put him in sort of the more early game categories. In fact, for the sake of trying to not fill up the all-rounder category too much, I will put Anubis in like maybe mid-game. I think mid-game is where Anubis spikes super hard when he's got like his Bancross and his boots and maybe like Typhons or some pen online. That's when Anubis like really spikes pretty hard. You could also argue for early mid though, because Anubis is also really strong in the early game. Like he has super good clear. His ult hits like an absolute truck at level 5. Maybe you could argue for Anubis should be early mid actually. Ao Kuang I think fits squarely in that late game. There's a small argument that you could put Ao Kuang in mid-late because he does sort of come online once he gets a few rings and stuff like that, but I think Ao Kuang is pretty much the definition of a late-game god. If I'm not putting Ao Kuang in here, there's going to be very few characters in this tier, so I think Ao deserves to be in there. Afro, probably mid-late. She has decent wave clear and like kind of decent early game, but really with Afro you're looking to get to that sort of mid to late game where you can like link to one of your carries or your jungler and just like go ham, like keeping people alive with your ult and the heals and stuff like that. And in the very early game, obviously she's not even getting full value out of her kit because she's not linked to someone. I think mid-late for Afro. Apollo, probably also mid-late. I think similar to AMC. Apollo's like about on the level of AMC, and so it's like he has some early game, but he is one of those hunters that's aimed a little bit more towards the late game, I would say. Arachne is definitely an early game god. Arachne is a god that really wants to just stomp the early game, run people down before they can get online, and then just snowball the game out of control. Arachne late game struggles super hard to get into team fights, has no real ultimate use outside of disengaging with it once she goes in. Definitely an early game god. Ares is either early, mid, or mid. I think early, mid, probably. Like, obviously, Ares chains early game are pretty iconic for how much ridiculous damage they do and the cripple time and stuff, but late game Ares does have some use. His 2 is surprisingly underrated for late game team fighting, and obviously his ultimate, if you can get a beads burner on the team, his ult can pull people pretty effectively. Artemis, hunter, and also a late game hunter. Definitely in the late game category here. Artemis early game really sucks. She has bad clear. Until she gets her ultimate online, she's very unsafe. Even with her ultimate, she's still quite unsafe in the laning phase, but the ult does give her quite a bit of safety. But she's really looking to get her full build online, press the ball in team fights, and just run people down with basics. She's really not going to do too much early game. Artio, probably an all-rounder, I think. I'm finding that I'm not actually overusing the all-rounder category all too much. We actually have the same amount in mid-late right now, so I think I'll put Artio in all-rounder. She's very strong early game, has a ton of abilities which makes her good in team fights and stuff like that. She has good CC for team fights, decent healing. I think an all-rounder is a pretty good spot for Artio. Athena's a weird one. Probably mid or mid-late is what I'm thinking. Because it's really sort of the mid-game when her ult and her taunt start really coming online. Like early game, you're leveling shield wall for a bit of wave clear and extra damage. I usually level shield wall to level 3 and then start leveling the taunt. So around the time of mid-game, you're starting to like really get value off of your ult and you're starting to get a lot of value from the taunt. But I feel bad putting her in mid-game because late-game Athena is still very good. The taunt, obviously super powerful. You can taunt the front line. It lasts like however long, 2.5, 3 seconds or something ridiculous. You just burn the front line. I think mid-late is probably where Athena belongs. Awilix, kind of all-rounder actually. She has like decent early game, especially once you get Feather Step leveled up, but late game she can also do stuff too. She's not like a super late game powerhouse, but especially if you use the ult for the steroid, and if you have knockups on your team, she can like do quite a lot of work late game. Awilix is a tough one. Maybe she's more of like a mid-game god actually. I don't think all-rounder really fits her too well, because her super early game is quite weak, and her super late game is also quite weak. I think she's more of like an early mid to mid-late style god, so probably mid is where I should put her. Baba Yaga, I'm gonna be completely honest, I have no idea where to put her. I don't really play her too much, I don't see people play her all that much. It feels like she has really strong late game. It's whether or not she has good early game, which I feel like she doesn't. I feel like Baba doesn't really do all too much early game. Like, you need to get those potions leveled up, and really you just need points in your abilities, honestly. I feel like early she's not doing all too much. But she's not useless early game in the way that like Artemis and Alquan kind of are, so I think mid-late is probably fine for Baba Yaga. I'm starting to get a little bit bloated on the mid-lates here, so if this starts happening where like there's so many gods in the mid to late games here, I'll start moving some of them either up or down, depending on how I feel. Bacchus is probably an all-rounder, I think. Obviously, he has great damage, he can burst people down pretty hard in the early game. Late game, his damage falls off a little bit in comparison to actual damage dealers because he is a support tank, but I'd say Bacchus is an all-rounder because late game he is still pretty useful. Like, he has the knock-up, which is one of the best CCs in the game. The burp is still pretty good if he's looking to burn beads and things like that. Bakasura, I think I'm going to want to put him in mid to late, actually. He's not like a super late game god, but Baka early game really wants to look to farm and get at least 3 items online before he starts fighting anyone. But really, even after that, you're looking to really get sort of like your kin size online, maybe your Bloodforge if that's the route you like to go, maybe your Abo or something for Pen. Baka really does want that late game, but he's not on the level of like Artemis Alquang where he's completely useless early. Like, once you get a couple of items, you can start doing stuff as Baka, but early game, especially in the jungle role, he's really more of just like a power farmer. Baron is definitely an all-rounder. Baron has like a slightly weak early game, but for the entire rest of the game, he's a very strong pick. Obviously, super good team fight with incredible AoE CC, healing, cleanses, all that kind of stuff. Pretty good damage if you're building him from mid. Bastet. So Bastet, before the rework, would have definitely been early game, but now I'm toying with putting her in early mid, I feel like. Because in the super early game, like before ultimates, Bastet is really kind of useless. She really kind of needs her ultimate to start doing stuff now. So I think early mid. You can maybe even argue for Bastet being a mid-game god at this point after the rework, but I think early mid is a good hedge bet. Bellona is a weird one. She obviously dominates lane, so maybe skewed slightly more towards early game. Bellona's team fight isn't the best. It's kind of hard to confirm her damage, and she really only has one good useful CC, and that's like her engage with the ultimate, or like an up-down or whatever with the ultimate, but it feels like late game she doesn't do too much other than like bully basic attack focused characters. She's definitely not in any of these top 3 tiers. She's not an all-rounder, she's not late or mid-late, because she has pretty bad late game. She's either mid or early mid, I think. Because she's definitely not super early game like Arachne. She doesn't become useless after 10 minutes, similar to how Arachne does if she hasn't snowballed the game ridiculously. But she is like a really big lane dominator that skews towards early game. Obviously Bludgeon, giving you the incredible wave clear in solo. I think I'll go with mid for now. But we'll see. Bellona could possibly move. Cabrakan? This is another weird one. At first glance, I kind of want to put him in all-rounder, actually. He has really strong early game. Good wave clear, obviously, with the 3 if you want to go that route in, like, solo lane or whatever. Late game, he has, like, decent CC, especially now that the 2 doesn't DR off of the 1. Or is it the other way around? The 1 doesn't DR off the 2. Something like that. His stuns don't DR each other, basically, anymore. So you can stun lock someone for, like, a solid couple of seconds, which is pretty good. The ult is obviously decent against characters that with no jumps or after people use their jumps. I feel like Cabrakan is a little hard to get in late game, though. You kind of need Blink for that. This one's a pretty tough placement, honestly. I think maybe we'll drop it in mid game for now. Camazotz is typically more early game skewed god. I think we'll go with early mid. Obviously, from solo, he's a little bit more skewed towards the late game. Not like late game, but sort of like maybe more towards mid from solo. But from jungle, he's like typically sort of like an early game burst damage god. Late game team fights, he kind of struggles because he has no good CC, not a great way to get in. The ult is obviously still really good for diving the backline. That's like one really big positive to him in the late game. He's super safe because he can just ult in the backline and buy some time, which is really nice. So maybe I'll put him in mid game for now, actually. Kernanos, probably on the similar level to AMC and Apollo. Once again, he's a hunter, he skews more late game, and he's one of the more sort of like on the later game end of hunters, I would say. Cerberus, definitely an all-rounder. He's got like really solid early game damage, good lane pressure, but also can do very well in team fights as well. Chuck, early mid or early? Probably early mid, since like he does have some usefulness like more towards the later stages of the game with his ult. But that's pretty much it. It feels like Chak is just an ult bot in teamfights. The rest of his kit doesn't do all too much unless he's super fed coming from solo or something. I don't think he's quite as early game as Arachne, which is why I don't want to put him down here, but he's close. He's like definitely almost dropping into the early category, I think. Chang'e, probably more like late game focused, right? Maybe mid-late. I feel like Chang'e's early game really isn't amazing. She has good poke in lane and stuff, but that sort of comes online more towards the early mid/mid game, not like early game. Yeah, I think mid-late for Chang'e. We'll leave her in there for now. Chernobog. This is another one that I don't really know. I haven't played against him too much. I don't play as him almost ever. I'm not a big ADC fan. It's probably safe to put him in mid-late, because he is a hunter. He has like pretty strong global rotation pressure. I think mid-late is a pretty safe bet for him. Chiron will probably go with mid-game. I feel like he's similar to Anher. Like, he has some pretty strong early to mid-game, like, ability burst damage, but late-game he will fall off a little bit. He's not, like, uber safe in late-game team fights, I feel like. Kronos, definitely late-game. His passive is literally, like, if the game goes to 30 minutes, you get 100 extra power. It's written in the text, basically, with this card. Like, he's definitely meant to be sort of a late-game pick. Cthulhu, all-rounder for sure. He bullies lane pretty hard in a lot of matchups. He has a strong mid-game, strong late-game, with obviously the ultimate giving you access to those really powerful, like, boosted abilities. Definitely an all-rounder god. Kukulkan probably skews more early game. His ultimate is still useful in team fights, and if you can get a good rage transform off, he can do work. But I think he skews more towards sort of like mid-game. Cupid's an interesting one. He's become very popular lately. I feel like I kind of want to put him in mid-game, but he could also be like mid-late, because he is somewhat useful late-game with like the ult and stuff like that. But I feel like Cupid is more of like a mid-game hunter, honestly. Daji, more late-game oriented, I would say. You could maybe argue for all-rounder, but her early game isn't amazing. Probably mid or mid-late for Daji. Probably mid-late. Like, her ultimate is really useful in teamfights. Discordia is more like late game skewed, right? I feel like Discordia's early game isn't the best. She really wants to be grouping up in team fights, getting big multi-man ults, big multi-man twos, stuff like that, hitting multiple people with the ones like pings. Yeah, I feel like Disco kind of just gets by in the early game. She is more of like a mid-late game god. Erlang Shen, definitely more skewed towards early game. Probably not early mid, I think probably more of like mid-game maybe. Because late game, Erlang really struggles with no CC immunity, no amazing defensive tools, especially if you're in jungle and using them offensively. I feel like Erlang comes online more so in the mid game though, when he has a couple of items and like a couple of abilities maxed and stuff like that. He's not really an early game god, necessarily. I think mid is pretty fair for him. Fafnir probably skews more late game, I would say. We're getting the mid-late category a little bit big here, so at some point in this tier list I may review this and move a few up to late or a few down to mid possibly. I think Fafnir is a pretty iconic mid-late game god though. Like really you're looking for those big transforms, big like AoE coerce boosts for objectives and sieging and stuff like that. Fafnir does better in late game team fights I would say than he does in like early game skirmishes. Because in your regular form, when you're not ulting, you really just have, like, the stun, that's it. Like, you have a disarm on the 3, but disarm's, like, a pretty obscure CC that doesn't really impact fights too much, especially in the 3v3. Fenrir, more of an early game god for sure. Probably early mid, I would say. Fenrir, like, obviously brutalized, it's insanely hard. His abilities in general hit really hard. Once you get to late game, generally he's just, like, kind of an ult bot. Like, his abilities won't do all too much, but his ult can be still pretty powerful late game, but I don't think that saves him, honestly. I think he's more of, like, an early mid-game god. Freya, definitely late game. One of those iconic magical ADCs that once you get the rings online, you can do so much work with her, but her early game does suffer quite a lot. That's typical Freya, to be honest. Obviously, she's been reworked a million times. At some point in those reworks, she was quite strong early, but not in this form, I wouldn't say. Ganesha, probably an all-rounder. A lot of Guardians, to me, seem to be kind of all-rounders, like support Guardians. They do pretty well in the laning phase, they just do their stuff, they roll in the mid-game, they do well in team fights, they tend to be quite good all-rounders. Geb, are we going mid-late or are we going whole hog and putting Geb in the late game category? I feel like Geb does best when he can like do big blink ult into 2 players late game, shield people, keep them alive. Geb's early game is really kind of rough, honestly. Yeah, I think I'll put Geb in the late game category. He's definitely more late game than the likes of like Amaterasu, Athena kind of stuff. Guan Yu's a weird one. Is Guan an all-rounder? I feel like my instinct is to put Guan late game because he kind of like has the heal and stuff like that and the big ult for team fights, but he's not bad in lane either. He has good wave clear with the 3 as long as you're not in a matchup where it can be easily interrupted. And he does have pretty good damage. Like the horse at any stage of the game is going to hit really hard if you can get it on someone that doesn't have a jump available. Guan's a weird one. Maybe he is just all-rounder. I feel like Guan is like... He doesn't do amazing in lane is the problem, especially in matchups that can interrupt. I think I'll drop him in all-rounder for now. Guan is a really tough one though. I'm struggling to play as Guan effectively. Hachiman, he's either mid or he's mid-late. Does Hachi compare more to AMC and Chernobog or more to Anher and Chiron is the question. I feel like probably more towards the late game with Hachi, honestly. Then again, he does do quite well in lane. Maybe he is more of like towards the mid game. He's sort of like an in-between of these two categories, but obviously there isn't a mid-late or anything like that. We're not going that far. So I think mid game is probably where he fits better. Hades, do we go early mid? Do we be generous to Hades and say that he does have some relevance later on in the game, or do we just go whole hog and put him early game? I think for the sake of the early game category having some kind of population, I'll put Hades in early game. He's really just a lane bully. Like, he wins almost every single matchup. Like, you have to really specifically look for a counter to Hades to actually win lane against him. But you have to really do a lot of work with the lead that you get in lane as Hades to actually have a big impact on like mid to late game. You know, once you pass like 20 minutes in the game, Hades just struggles to really do anything. Like, people just jump out of his ult even if you can silence them and you don't get them in there long. Hebo, I think Hebo's a good all-rounder. He has pretty decent early game because the one's on such a short cooldown, you have decent clear. His like super early game before level 5 isn't the best, but after that, Hebo's really gonna sort of like burst you down at any stage of the game really. He's stronger late, I would say, like he's an all-rounder that skews a little more late game, but even in the mid game, Hebo's gonna do a ton of damage to you once he gets like his 3 and his 1 leveled up a little bit. Hell, definitely late game. Hell can hit pretty hard if she gets like a big lead in the mid game. Like Repulse and the 1 in Dark Stance hit harder than people expect, I feel like. But she's one of those healers where like you're really looking to get towards the late game with her more. Heimdallr? Is Heimdallr an all-rounder? I feel like he's pretty good late game. Like the ult is obviously insanely good for team fighting. Horn cancel AAs can do a lot, but he's pretty safe in lane as well. Decent early game damage. Maybe he's an all-rounder, dude. This would be the first hunter that I would classify as an all-rounder. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking too much in terms of like hunters. He's pretty all-rounder for a hunter, but like... Really, does he have as strong early game as like some of the other all-rounders that I put in? Kinda no, right? Maybe I'll put him in mid game for now. Hera, I feel like Hera aims more late game, right? She's kind of similar to Disco. Like, she really wants to get some points in her abilities before she starts like properly going ham. Hercules... Is it my bias putting Hercules an all-rounder? Is he actually kind of weak late game? That's the question. Like, obviously, he's pretty countered by anti-heal, and you really need to be able to hit the pull, because his ult late game ain't going to do too much. Maybe it's a bit generous to put Hercules in all-rounder, maybe he's more of like a mid-game. Obviously, he has tons of early game bully potential, both from support and from solo. In support, he kind of just like runs the map in solo, and he wins the laning phase against a lot of picks. But he does still have some relevance late game is the thing. I think maybe I'll put him mid game. He's not like as good late game as like a lot of the picks up here. Like, is he really as good late game as Guan? No, not really. Horus, probably mid late. And then again, Horus does a lot of early game damage. Horus is one of the weird ones where he's sort of a reverse bell curve. He's like really strong early, falls off a bit mid, and then like really strong late. It's a weird one with Horus. Like, does that classify as all-rounder where he kind of like falls off a bit in the mid game, but then he's like super strong late game and early game? Maybe all-rounder is where I should put him. Hu Yi, probably, he's one of those ones where like he could either be mid-late or he could be mid, really. I think I'll put him mid-late. Hunbat's also probably mid-late. He has some like decent early game burst damage, or not early game really, more sort of mid-game burst damage, but with Hunbat's you're really looking to get to those late game team fights, play around your ultimate, get big multi-man fears, and win the game off of that. The goddess who shall not be named, probably early mid, I would say. Isis is really, I just said her name anyways. That whole shtick with the goddess that shall not be named, that is now pointless. But yeah, Isis is more of like an early to mid game god, I would say. Obviously, Wingust is just like insane wave clearing mid. Almost no one, you know, maybe Agni, a couple of others could like compete with Isis clear, but Wingust is just so strong early game. And she has a lot of like early objective pressure as well. The main reason I'm considering like putting her in mid game possibly is that like she has like decent objective pressure for like late game and stuff like that, but really when you think of Isis you think of Wingust and like early game clear and stuff like that. I think early mid is pretty fair for her. He's an army, another god that I really don't play against too much. This one's going to be a little difficult. She obviously has really strong early game because boomerang auto attacks, she out clears basically every other hunter in the game, but in terms of like actual kill potential early, it's not amazing. She's more just like a super pressure power farm machine, and if you get a lot of poke, you can have kill potential. Late game, she's a little unsafe. The invisibility dash has a really long wind up. The invisibility is relatively easy to track, and once she gets hit by anything, she's pulled out of it immediately. Probably more towards the mid late. Once again, she's kind of one of those reverse bell curve type characters, similar to Horus, in that she's very strong early game, not amazing mid, and then obviously strong late because she's a hunter. Bit of a weird one with Izanami. I think I'll leave her in mid-late for now, but she could maybe even be considered an all-rounder, honestly. It's just, considering a hunter and all-rounder is super weird for me, because hunters tend to be just, like, skewed massively towards the late game. Janus, definitely more of a late game god. His early game's not amazing, his clear suffers a little bit. To get big damage from Janus in, like, the early to mid-game, you really need to be using aggressive portals, and then that puts you at, like, a real risk of being dives and stuff like that if you're aggro portaling all the time. He's either mid-late or he's straight up late, but I think he's mid-late. Like, in the mid-game, like when Janus has a couple of items coming online, like boots a couple of items, maybe 3 items after boots or something like that, you can start doing some pretty big damage. But you're mainly looking for Janus's like big rotation potential and teamfight presence in the late game, to be honest. Jingwei might be the first hunter I put in all-rounder, actually. She has decent early game because she's super safe in the lane. She's gonna get the job done. She can just fly back from lane if she ever gets poked out. She has decent enough wave clear. And then obviously, she's a hunter. Once she gets to late game, she'll be pretty strong. I think Jingwei is actually, if any hunter is going to be an all-rounder, it's probably Jingwei, or maybe Ula or something, because he has very good early game as well. Jormungandr, probably all-rounder too, actually. He's another one of those Guardians that just feels like he's pretty good early game. He has a lot of pressure from both solo and from support. No one plays him in support really anymore, but mostly from solo, he has like really good lane pressure, can bully pretty hard in a lot of matchups. And then late game, his disruption is pretty solid. Kali, I'm sure, maybe I even put it in the thumbnail, everyone thinks of Kali when you think of like a late game god. She's one of the ones that you just think, you know, if I'm doing a power curve tier list, Kali's going to be the top tier for that. So yeah, Kali definitely much more of a late game god. Don't think I really need to explain it too much, but yeah, her whole target mechanic and the fact that she can go invincible and the fact that she has pretty crappy early game damage, especially after like level 9 or so, she starts to really fall off. But then late game, once she gets like the correct target picks and just starts full healing for every single kill she gets, she can run through entire teams on her own, basically. She's probably the most late game god, I would say. Khepri, kind of a weird one. He has good lane pressure because the two, like, you can hit your own minions, you can hit the enemy minions, you decrease their clear speed, increase yours is pretty good. But I feel like Khepri does aim a little more late game. Like, clutch reses in the late game can be pretty good. Probably more towards like mid-late. Khepri could maybe be considered an all-rounder, but I'm putting a lot of Guardians just in the all-rounder category, so I think I'll put him in mid-late. King Arthur, definitively mid-game, I would say, for King Arthur. His early isn't amazing, like until he gets sort of level 9, he gets his 1 maxed, he gets his second point in his ult and can start like really bullying late. He gets like his Gaia or his breastplate online or something like that, and then coming into that mid-game when you hit the Glad Shield power spike and you just King Arthur in general with like 6 abilities or 8 abilities if you count the ults versus everyone else's 4. you just kind of run the game in the mid game. But Arthur late game is really countered heavily by cripples. Just not amazing late game, to be honest. Kukulkan. So he's actually pretty safe early because you can just like tornado the wave, but you do have to run up to tornado the wave and that can be a little unsafe. I'd say he's probably a mid-late game mage, honestly. He has like incredibly big damage late game, like the 1 into Polynomicon basic hits super hard, the ult obviously hits really hard, the 3 if they stand in it for a while, and also on objectives the 3 hits super hard as well. I think mid-late game is pretty fair for him. Kumbhakana, weird one. I feel like Kumba skews a little more late game, but maybe he's an all-rounder. He has decent enough early game. Especially like sort of early mid and mid game when his damage starts to come online, similar to Bacchus. He has like a lot of pressure in the big game when like his ult is chunking you for like 30% of your health or so. And then late game he's just like a big CC powerhouse monster. Like he can banish people out of the fight, set up for the rest of his team. The Mez is obviously really good. Yeah, I feel like all-rounder for Kumba is absolutely fine. Kuzenbo, once again, probably skews more late, but I think all-rounder for Kuzenbo is fine. It can do some work early game, especially with the cheesy 3 push you through the wave strat. You can chunk people really hard in solo and in support by doing that, if you're not prepared for it. Loki, probably mid or mid-late, I would say. Especially after the rework. I'm thinking more so of like tank Loki, but like jungle Loki as well. I feel like he needs a few points in his abilities to properly get his damage online. Probably mid-game, I would say. Like, super late-game Loki does struggle to get in still, in a similar way to he did before the rework. Medusa is more of an early-game hunter, so probably mid-game, I would say. Similar to Anher and stuff, she's looking for early pressure. She has a lot of early-game ability burst damage. A lot of decent wave clear, stuff like that. Good poke. Mercury, he's either mid-late or he's late. People are probably shocked that I would consider putting Mercury anywhere outside of the late games here, but like, once you get into the mid sort of late game, Mercury actually does put some pressure on. Nah, I think I'll put him in late. I think there's no reason putting him in like the same tier as a lot of the gods that are down here. Like, he does come online later than like, you know, a Hunbats or a Huyi or something, for example. Merlin skews more late. I don't think he's full on late game, but he's like on the upper end of mid late, I would say. It takes a while for Merlin to properly get stuff online, and like he's a really sort of objective pressure focused god. We'll go mid late for him. Mulan. Mulan's an interesting one. I feel like she skews more early game, honestly. Despite her mechanic that allows her to level up her abilities. Usually by like the mid game, you have your abilities like kind of done, or the ones that you need are kind of done. But like Mulan's early game damage is just absolutely dumb. Like, I don't know if anyone's looked at Mulan's damage numbers. Her 2 hits for 120 at rank 1, which is like 40 or 50 more damage than like almost any other warrior ability at rank 1. I don't know why it hits so hard, but it does. Her 1, I believe, hits her 140 at rank 1 or something, though, because it's 2 hits. She's just like super strong early game damage. I feel like early mid or mid. Maybe mid. Just because of like her evolving mechanic, and like as you go into the mid game, you're sort of hitting your power spikes from ranking up your abilities and things like that. Neith fits exactly in that category of like Anher and Medusa and stuff. Like pretty strong ability burst damage in the early game. Like it's like for a hunter, she's more early game focused, but just on the fact that she is a hunter, I think mid game. Nemesis typically looks for more late game. Probably mid late, I would say. She's not on the level of like a Kali or a Mercury. She does come online before they do for sure. But she definitely takes a bit longer to get online than the likes of like a Willix or a Camazotz or something like that. Neja. I think Neja's pretty squarely a mid game god. Late game, he can do some work, like the ult does hit really hard once you like full build, but it is cleansable in team fights, and he can struggle to get in sometimes. I think like mid game is where Neja really spikes, where like people's beads are on cooldown a lot, or they don't have their beads yet, and like your ult hits super hard, and the ring bounce is like bouncing between multiple people, and you've just like hit it on rank 9 or whatever. I mean level 9, sorry, rank 5 on the ring bounce. I think mid game for Neja. Nike. Why do I put Nike? All-rounder probably? I feel like she is more of an all-rounder god. She does okay in lane, pretty strong mid-game, pretty strong late game. Nox, more late game focused, I would say. Nox early game, kind of weak, especially if you can't hit the combos, but like her wave clear is not the best. They did make her wave clear a little better now that the one hits minions though, that's the thing. I think mid-late. Nuwa, probably also mid-late. A lot of these mid-mages seem to be landing in this category for me. Odin. Probably all-rounder for Odin, I feel like. He does have a pretty strong early game, but like his late game presence is something as well. Is it though? He has pretty bad late game actually. It's more so like he has good early mid, good mid late, or like decent mid late, but his late game kind of falls off quite a lot. Maybe that's warranting of an all-rounder though. I think it probably is. Olaron looking more late game. Is that a mid late or full on late? Probably full on late game. Like, you're really looking for that big, like, ult pressure in team fights with Olaron. And, like, you want to get his, like, Bancross talent and his rings and stuff online. Osiris, more early game focused. Early mid, probably, or maybe mid. Osiris late game is pretty difficult. His ult is kind of, like, not too impactful. Unless you're, like, specifically ulting a healer, but I'm not really counting, like, a counter matchup in that way. But he's really just like an early game lane bully. It's pretty hard to lose lane as Osiris against most matchups. Late game, he's kind of just like a mitigation machine and throws annoying slows at people. He's either mid or he's early mid. I think I'll go mid. Pele, squarely mid game, I would say. Similar to Neja, Pele like really comes online in the mid game, I would say. She's not like amazing early game. She's not amazing late, but mid game is where like she really power spikes. I feel like a lot of sort of ability based assassin junglers power spike pretty hard in the mid game. Persephone, definitely late game. Correct me if I'm wrong because I don't play Persephone, but from what I've seen, I've played against it, I've seen other people play it, I've seen SPL footage, she seems like more of like a late game pick in my opinion. Poseidon, definitely more early game focused. It's either early mid or mid. Because like once you get Kraken online, Poseidon is hella scary for a long time until you get more towards the late game where like one Kraken is going to decide his entire impact in a team fight, then he sort of becomes a bit weaker because once you Kraken, if you whiff on the Kraken, like if you only hit one person or you only hit a tank and you don't secure the kill or something like that, or if they Aegis, like Poseidon once his Krakens down is kind of useless, but in the early to mid game where the fights are just like you can blow two people up with a Kraken, win the fight and get a Gold Fury off of it, that's when Poseidon is like at his strongest. I think we'll go early mid. He could definitely be pushed up to mid though, I think, because his Kraken pressure does extend well into the mid game. Actually, yeah, I'm going to move him up to mid. I think he fits better there, honestly. Ra? Is Ra an all-rounder that... He kind of skews more late game, but maybe he's all-rounder? Where did I just put him? Oh, he's here. He just, like, disappeared for a second. Ra. Like, obviously his healing is much more impactful in the late game. That brings his late game up quite a lot. His damage really doesn't come online until later on, but... Honestly, I've been chunked by Raz in the mid game that just 2 walk up to me and 1 me, and that does, like, 40-50% of my health. Like, I feel like his damage does come online kind of in the mid-game, so maybe he's one of the mid-late mages. Raijin, probably the same. It feels like a lot of the mid-mages just fall into this category that are aiming for sort of, like, coming online in the mid-game and then really hitting their power spikes mid to late. Rama... He's mid-late or he's full-on late. He's probably mid-late, because he does have pretty, like, good, decent wave pressure that can, like, keep him even as he goes into the mid stages of the game. Like, obviously his Astral Arrows, really good wave clear. Pretty safe in the lane as well. Rat, so obviously Rat has a couple of different ways you can build him, but I think in general he's a mid-game god. If you're playing him from solo, you're looking to rotate in the mid-game with the big ult and stuff like that. If you're playing him from jungle, you're just looking to pressure sort of like early mid. You could argue Rat should be an early mid maybe. I think since we have almost no one down in the early mid, maybe Rat should go down here. Raven, mid-game I would say. Similar to Neja, like a lot of these other ability-based assassins, Pele or Wheelix, he really hits his power spikes in the mid-game. Scylla... late, probably. You can maybe argue for her being mid-late, but I think Scylla comes online later than the likes of, like, Nox, Nuwa, Merlin, Ra. Like, I think they come online faster than Scylla does, really. Obviously, her passive is literally, like, hit level 20 to get the max value out of it. So, like, she definitely skews more late game. Serket is probably an all-rounder, I would say. Pretty decent early game, but also can do solid late game as well. I think Serket is pretty much the definition of an all-rounder, really, which is surprising for an assassin. Typically, assassins aren't all-rounders. They're not really a class that's built for that. Like most all-rounders, you probably see up here, they're like they're mostly warriors and guardians and stuff like that. Set. Mid-late. He's not like super late game. Once you get like a few items online with Set, you can start wreaking havoc on the backline. I don't think late game is where he belongs, but mid-late is pretty fair for him. Skadi, one of those mid-game hunters. Sobek. All-rounder probably. He's one of those guardians where like he can hold his own in laning phases for the most part. Pluck is always scary at any stage of the game. If you get plucked in the wrong situation, you're dead no matter what the time of the game is, really. Sol, mid-late. Wukong, definitely an all-rounder. Wukong is like pretty strong backline dive, very safe. Wins lane in a lot of matchups, or goes even in the ones that he doesn't. I think Wukong is actually the definition of an all-rounder. I think no god in this tier is more of an all-rounder than Wukong. Like, Wukong's just good all the time, but never like super amazing at any stage of the game. Susanoo is actually an assassin that scales late game a little better than a lot of the other ones, mostly due to like super strong AA cancelling and just high scaling on his abilities in general. If you're building full power with Bloodforge, you can just nuke people pretty hard. It feels kind of rough to put a jungler in mid-late though. Most junglers aren't mid-late because they need early game pressure. Although I have Daji in here, I feel like Susanoo is similar to Daji, like he's going to come online at about the same time. Sylvanas. Sylph's a weird one. His lack of mobility is kind of rough in late game teamfights, but he does still have strong pressure in teamfights with like the ult and the healing and stuff like that. But Sylvanas early game is also good, like he has the AoE auto attacks for wave clear, pretty strong pressure in the lane. Maybe it's just an all-rounder. I feel bad just dumping a lot of the Guardians in all-rounder, but that's kind of how they are. A lot of Guardians and Warriors are kind of built to be all-rounders. Terra though definitely aims more late game, right? I feel like Terra is sort of like a mid-late Guardian. You're really looking for like hitting multiple people with that big value ult in the team fights and getting big AoE roots and stuff like that. She does have some healing, which is typically a more late game trait because healing is better when you're like grouping up and you've just had like a big clash in a team fight. You can group up and heal your entire team, so healing gods tend to skew a little more late game. Thanatos, the exact opposite of Kali. You're probably all expecting me to put him in early game. I think I'm going to put him early mid though. Thanatos does have a little bit of relevance late game. In the current meta, you can kind of build in full damage and get away with just like going for assassinations in the late game, but also he has the execute, which does keep him a little bit relevant later on in the game. Similar to Fenrir in a way, like Fenrir's ult is still useful late game in team fights because it's kind of a free kill if they don't have beads. Morrigan definitely late, I think. Either mid late or late, but I feel like Mori comes online later than the likes of Nuwa, Nox, Ra, Melon, that kind of stuff. Obviously, you want like the big transforms in team fights because you sort of have like two kits in a way with Morrigan, and also like her generic like stun burst combo. That's only really going to start doing like hefty chunks of damage later in the game, I would say. Thor. Is Thor an all-rounder? Kind of is, right? Is early games a little weak? Is mid games a little... not his mid game, sorry. Is early games a little weak? Is late game is a little weak? It's an argument of whether I'm going to put him mid, because that is definitely where he's strongest, or whether he's like got a decent enough late and early game to consider him an all-rounder. Because full damage Thor, like when you full combo someone from the ult, with the ult like AR cancel, hammer, AR cancel, stun, AR cancel 3, that's going to one-shot a carry late game with full damage Thor. That didn't used to be the case before his rework, but it kind of is now. And you can like still go a little bit more into Bruiser Thor, especially if you're from solo. Bruiser Thor's pretty solid from solo. I think all-rounder is actually pretty good for Thor, honestly. You could put him mid as well, because that is definitely where he peaks in the mid game, but I think all-rounder for Thor's pretty good. Toth, definitely looking more late game. Pretty vulnerable early game, especially if you're using the dash to clear, which sometimes you do. You have to clean up like the last bit of the wave with your dash, which is pretty risky. But he's like that super safe artillery mage, like looking to stand in the back line of late game team fights and just pump damage down range. I think mid-late, but he's on like the upper end of mid-late. I think I may do some more rearranging of this category because like Nox, for example, I think Nox comes online a lot earlier than the likes of Merlin and Thoth. There's definitely a lot of variance in this category. Maybe I'll move a couple up or down. I'm going to sort of sort this tier list out a little bit once we're done with it, I think, because some of them, I think, in hindsight, after placing everyone else, some of them can move up or down. Tsukuyomi, he's not amazing late. He kind of struggles to get in, and if you don't use the ult correctly, you're just going to end up in the enemy's backline and with no way out. Because he has no defensive mobility, really, outside of, like, maybe dropping caltrops so people can't chase you. So maybe sort of, like, mid-game, I think, for Tsukuyomi. Tier mid or early mid. Putting solo laners early mid is kind of rough because, like, they only really have a laning phase. Solo laners need to be kind of useful mid-game, at least. You know, at least useful mid-game, because that's really when you can start having an impact on the game. You can't have much of an early-game impact, really. Other than, like, winning lane, getting a lead, getting totems, maybe invading enemy back camps and stuff. That's as much as, like, an early-game impact you can have as a solo laner. So maybe I'll put tier mid. Ula, I think, is the one other hunter I'm going to put all-rounder, because Ula actually does have a lot of early-game damage and pressure. But obviously, it's still a hunter, he still works well late game, and mid game is where Ula peaks for sure. Mid game is like where his burst damage combos are 80%ing you, and you gotta be, if you take a tiny bit of poke, you gotta fear dying to an Ularax. That's when he's at his strongest, but late game, especially with the correct build, he can still do hunter things and just basic attack you to death, and early game, he's still quite strong as well. For mana, also an all-rounder. Sort of like ability based in the laning phase, he has good wave clear, good pressure, but late game, he can also just press forward and run people down. Vulcan skews more late game, definitely one of those mid to late game mages for sure, on the upper end of this tier, definitely. Xbalanque, mid late or late? Probably late, I would say. He's not quite as late game as Artemis, but he's definitely like more late game than the likes of stuff like Apollo and Chernobog that I have in this tier. I think late game is fine for him. Xingtian, I feel like Xing looks a little more to the late game. Like, the basic attack reducing on his 1 is super strong, like, later in the game when you can just put it on the Hunter. The ult is obviously pretty relevant. A lot of those Guardian-style ults that are just, like, beads or die type ultimates are pretty useful in the late game. Maybe mid-late for Xingtian here. Yamoja, all-rounder, right? Yamoja's just, like, always strong, I feel like. She has super strong late game teamfight presence, she's a healer, but she also has really good laning phase presence because of the fact that you don't have cooldowns. You can just spam all your abilities whenever you need them, clear the wave super fast. She's definitely an all-rounder. Yumiya, probably mid-game. He suffers a little bit in the late game because of like lack of mobility and stuff. His ult late game is really kind of useless because like you're not... If you just sat there ulting, most people are going to get out of it and you're just wasting your time when you could be like ready to peel for your teammates or like freeze people and stuff. Zeus, mid-late. He can do a lot of stuff early game, but he needs a lead to be able to do that. Zeus is really looking to get through that early game to where like his support can start rotating and help him out and stuff, keep him alive. And Zhonghui is also a little bit kind of like mid-late or maybe mid. Let's go with mid-late for now. So that's my initial tier list. I'm going to do a few reorderings though, so I will be right back once I've changed a few things.
12 seconds later.
Alright, I've reorganized things a little bit. I've mostly just moved some mages around. So a lot of the mid-late game mages came down to the mid category, like Nuwa, Nox, Raijin, Baba Yaga. I moved Apuash out of all-rounder. That was one of like the early placings. I don't think Apuash really fits in terms of like all-rounders based on what else we have in the tier now. I moved Janus up to late game as well. So now we have more of like the mid-late game is sort of like a consolidation of the actual mid-late game mages, because I kind of just put every mage in that category really. So now it's like actual mid-late game mages like Zeus, Thoth, Vulcan, Ra, Aphrodite, mages like that. And I also moved a couple of people down to early game because Arachne and Hades being there on their own felt a bit wrong. I feel like Chak and Thana would also be considered on that level of like early game. So obviously this tier list does skew more towards mid game because generally that's when like you need to be strong in Smite. Like, you don't need a super strong early game usually unless you're just trying to snowball, and a lot of games don't go so late that these late game picks will really come into their full relevance. And obviously, like, all-rounder is a pretty large tier as well, because being an all-rounder in Smite is obviously going to be a good thing, and typically, gods are designed to be more sort of like either mid-game focused or like all-rounder focused. It's generally like outliers that are super early game or super late game. But yeah, that's my thoughts. I'm sure you disagree on some of these placements, given there's like over 100 of them, and it's really difficult to sort of put these gods, especially into their individual tiers. Like, even within the tiers, a lot of them kind of differ. Like, I definitely wouldn't say Susano is like on the same level of power curve as like Aphrodite, for example. Aphro's much more like late, and Susano's on like the lower end of that tier, where you could almost consider him a mid-game god. But I feel like Susano isn't really one of those mid-game assassins. He's more like a mid sort of late-game assassin. But yeah, let me know your thoughts down below. If you have any other tier list ideas, I like making these and they're pretty easy to make. I just turn my face cam on, record myself for like an hour putting circles in tiers, and then put the video up, and you guys seem to enjoy them. So if you have any other tier list videos, ideas for tier list videos, sorry, then let me know down below, and I will catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.